why does someone commit a crime? It feels like maybe a simple question on the surface, but when you really start digging, wow, you find centuries of debate, a whole field trying to figure it out.
It really does. It gets right to the core of, human nature, how societies work, what keeps us in line, and yeah, what makes some people step outside that. It's a puzzle we're still piecing together.
And that's exactly what we're digging into today. We had a listener share their introductory criminology theory module, which is fantastic. So
Yeah.
think of this as like a fast track to understanding how the very first thinkers approached crime.
Precisely. So if you're curious about the foundations, or maybe you just need a solid overview without getting bogged down in dense academic stuff, this should give you a really good framework, a way to see the different perspectives.
Yeah, the core ideas. So the source is that intro module, looking at early theories. Our mission today, let's unpack what criminology theory is, how we even evaluate these ideas, and then dive into those first explanations for crime. Sound good?
Absolutely. Let's jump right in. So first things first, what is criminology theory?
Okay, so the module gives a pretty straightforward definition, actually. A system of thought used to explain something. Simple enough.
Hmm.
And for us specifically, a system of thought used to explain crime. That's our starting point.
Yeah, that basic definition is key. But what's really important to get right away is that criminology isn't looking for like one magic bullet theory, one explanation for all crime. The source calls this theoretical pluralism.
Theoretical pluralism. That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Because the reason someone does one thing
Right.
is probably completely different from why someone else does another. The module had that great example, Will Smith slapping Chris Rock versus, say, a catfishing scam.
Totally different motivations, exactly. Human behavior is just. It's
Right.
complex. There are internal factors, external ones, mental state, background, social pressures, all sorts of
So many variables.
Yeah. So criminology uses this whole range of theories. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they even, conflict a bit. But it tries to capture that complexity. And it's not just about different reasons for crime. It's also, crucially, about realizing that how we even define something as crime can change depending on the theory we're using.
Ah, interesting point. It stops us from trying to just apply one solution to every problem.
Exactly. It avoids that one-size-fits-all trap.
Okay, so if there are all these different theories, how do we organize them? The module mentions three main types, right? Crime creation, causation, and control. Let's maybe break those down.
Let's do it. So theories of crime creation. These theories look at how we as a society actually decide what is a crime. The political, legal, cultural forces that draw those lines.
Which is fascinating when you think about it. What counts as crime isn't always set in stone. The module used examples like recreational drug use or doctor-assisted suicide.
Things where there's a lot of debate. Is it illegal? Should it be? Is it immoral?
So the definition of crime itself can shift.
It absolutely can. Then you have theories of crime causation. And, well, like the name suggests, these are focused on why crime happens, what's going on in the person's mind, or what's in their environment that might be a factor.
Okay, the why.
Yeah, the why. And the source notes this is where most of the focus tends to be, especially in introductory material like this.
That makes sense. We want to understand the roots. Okay, and the third type, theories of crime control.
Right. So this is about the response. How does the criminal justice system deal with crime? Policing strategies, sentencing approaches, types of punishment, all that.
The module mentioned the broken windows theory here.
It did, yeah. That's the idea that like tackling smaller signs of disorder like vandalism or, well, broken windows might help prevent more serious crime later on. Well, it's a theory that's generated a lot of discussion and some controversy too about how effective it really is and how it's been applied.
Okay, got it. So those are the types of theories, creation, causation, control. But then the module also talked about different levels, like different zoom levels, criminal, micro, and macro theory. What's the distinction there?
That's a great way to put it, zoom levels. So criminal theory is zoomed right in on the individual offender, their mind, their body, their internal conditions. Classical theory is an example the module gives, focusing on rational choice, which we'll probably get to later.
So focus tightly on the person. Okay, then micro theory. How does that zoom out?
Micro theory pulls back a bit to look at the immediate situation, the local environment, maybe the person's social circle, friends, family, the specific circumstances surrounding the crime. Social learning theory fits here, the idea that people learn criminal behavior from others around them. Again, something for later discussion.
Right, so not just the person, but their immediate world.
Yeah.
And then macro theory. That's the widest lens.
That's the widest lens, yeah. You're looking at the big societal structures, Laws, politics, the economy, social inequality. How do these large-scale features shape crime patterns?
So, like, how the rules of the whole game might affect things.
Exactly. Critical Marxist theory, for instance, looks at economic oppression in capitalist systems as a potential driver of crime. That's a macro-level explanation.
Okay, that provides a really clear map, types and levels. But how do we actually judge these theories? How do we know if one is, better than another? The module mentioned this can get tricky.
It really can. Evaluating theories isn't always simple. You run into complex concepts, even philosophical questions. The module mentions epistemology.
Epistemology. Okay, that's a big word. But basically, it's about knowledge, right? Like, what do we know? How do we know it? And crucially, how reliable is what we think we know?
You nailed it. And the module gives that great example of crime statistics. They're often flawed because, well, not all crime gets reported, so our knowledge can be incomplete right from the start.
That makes sense. So, how does this epistemology thing connect to evaluating theories?
Well, there are different philosophical takes on knowledge. The module highlights two: objectivism and constructivism.
Okay, objectivism. That sounds like objective truth. Like, there are real facts out there we can discover?
Pretty much, it's the belief in independent, universal truths that we can uncover, often through scientific methods.
Huh.
You might hear the term positivism linked to this, relying on observable facts, evidence.
It's appealing, right? The idea of certainty.
Definitely. But the module raises a good point.
Mm.
If it's all objective, why do scientific ideas change?
Yeah.
Like the example of people thinking bad genes caused crime back in the day, that view changed.
Exactly. Our scientific truths evolve, they get refined, sometimes even overturned, which leads to the other perspective, constructivism.
Okay, so what's constructivism?
Constructivism suggests there aren't necessarily absolute independent truths just waiting to be found. Instead, knowledge is something humans create. It's shaped by our society, our culture, our institutions.
So truth is more relative, dependent on context. In a way, yes. Think about the definition of crime itself. Is it defined by religion, by law, by social norms? Constructivism highlights that these definitions are human constructs, not objective realities floating out there.
That seems really relevant to criminology. The module says this deep dive, like the course it came from, tries to balance these two views.
Yeah, which seems sensible, recognizing the value of evidence and scientific methods, but also understanding that our knowledge is shaped by social context.
Okay, so keeping those philosophical ideas in mind, how do we actually evaluate a specific criminology theory? The module laid out three main criteria: logic, validity, and utility.
Exactly. These are the tools we use. Let's start with logic.
Logic. So does the theory make sense internally? Is the reasoning sound? Does it contradict itself?
Spot on. Are the arguments coherent? The module used that kind of funny example, a theory saying only people wearing blue shirts commit crime.
Right.
Logically, there's just no connection. The color of a shirt doesn't cause criminal behavior. It fails the logic test right away.
Okay, that's clear. It has to hang together. What about validity? That sounds important.
Crucial. Validity is about evidence. Does the theory match up with observations from the real world? Is it supported by research?
So does it actually work in practice?
Pretty much. Going back to the silly blue shirt theory. Imagine, hypothetically, that studies did consistently find a correlation. Police data, market research, whatever, all pointing to blue shirt wearers committing more crime.
Even if it sounds absurd, if the data backed it up.
It would have some validity. We might not know why, but the evidence would support it to some degree. But the module also rightly notes that validity in social science is often more of a spectrum. It's complex.
Because it's hard to control everything, context matters.
Exactly. Findings can vary. So strong theories usually have evidence from lots of different studies in different contexts, generally pointing in the same direction. Validity isn't usually an all-or-nothing thing.
Okay. Logic, validity.
Right.
And the third one was utility.
Utility. Basically, how useful is the theory? Does it help us understand crime better? Does it offer practical guidance for how to respond?
Right. So even if our blue shirt theory was somehow logical and valid,
Its utility would be terrible. Imagine telling police, just focus on people in blue shirts. It would be incredibly efficient, unfair, and wouldn't address any real causes of crime.
a total misdirection of resources.
Completely. But utility isn't always about direct policing strategies. A theory can be useful if it draws attention to broader issues like, say, poverty or inequality, even if the police can't directly fix poverty. It changes how we think about the problem.
So usefulness can be indirect too, shaping our understanding.
Precisely. It can guide policy or prevention efforts in a broader sense.
Okay, great. That gives us a solid toolkit: logic, validity, utility. Now, let's go way back. Pre-Enlightenment theories. The module mentioned roots in ancient Greece: Plato, Aristotle.
Yeah, even way back then, thinkers were grappling with why people break rules. Plato talked about moral weakness, lack of self-control. Aristotle focused more on free will, but how desire could lead people astray. But the module really focuses on the period closer to the Enlightenment, around the 18th century, when spiritualism was a dominant force.
Right, spiritual explanations. The module highlighted how tightly linked church and government were then. Religious ideas of sin and evil heavily influenced how people understood crime.
Absolutely.
Right.
And a very common belief back then was that evil behavior, crime, was caused by, well, demonic forces, the devil, evil spirits.
Seriously, like literal demons.
That was the belief, that the devil was actively tempting people, promising them things, sex, wealth, power, to lure them into wrongdoing, or even outright possession.
Wow. That's a world away from how we generally think now. External supernatural forces pulling the strings. The module also mentioned witches.
Yes, a strong connection was made between crime, deception, and witchcraft. The idea was that witches could possess people, cast spells, and force them to commit crimes against their will.
So the person wasn't even seen as fully responsible sometimes. It was the witch's fault.
That was often the belief, and the crime control that followed from that was, well, hunting and often killing accused witches.
Which led to things like the Salem witch trials. The module mentioned King James VI's book, Demonology.
Yes, that book really fueled the witch hunt frenzy in Britain and the colonies. And it contributed to the climate that allowed the Salem witch trials in 1692 to happen, ending with 19 people being executed based on spectral evidence and accusations of witchcraft. A truly dark chapter.
Chilling. So let's apply our evaluation tools, logic, validity, utility to these pre-Enlightenment spiritual theories. How do they stack up?
Well, not very well, frankly. Let's start with logic.
Okay, logic. The module raised some good questions. If demons cause crime, are all criminals possessed? Why don't they remember it? Why do some confess and say they chose to do it?
Exactly. There are major logical gaps and inconsistencies. The explanations don't really hold together under scrutiny.
Right. What about validity? Can we test these ideas?
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? How do you scientifically measure demonic possession or witchcraft? There's simply no known way to test these claims. And the very existence of such supernatural forces is, well, highly improbable and certainly not supported by empirical evidence.
So 0 points for testability and validity, basically.
Pretty much. And then utility. We've already touched on this.
Yeah, the Salem witch trials, the consequences were horrific.
Absolutely. These theories justified incredibly brutal and unjust treatment. The module mentions the methods: public humiliation, binding, sleep deprivation to force confessions, those awful water tests where sinking meant innocence and floating meant guilt. It led to the torture and death of innocent people.
So in terms of utility, these theories were actively harmful.
Immensely harmful. There was no positive utility, only tragic outcomes. It's really no surprise that as Enlightenment thinking, emphasizing reason and evidence, took hold, these spiritual explanations rapidly lost favor in criminology.
Yeah, it's pretty clear why we moved on. Okay, so let's quickly recap what we've covered in this deep dive.
Sounds good.
We defined criminology theory systems of thought to explain crime. We talked about theoretical pluralism, why having multiple theories is actually necessary.
Right, because crime is complex.
Yeah.
Then we looked at the evaluation criteria. Logic doesn't make internal sense. Validity, is it backed by evidence? And utility, is it actually useful?
And we finished by looking at those early pre-Enlightenment spiritual theories, demons, witches, and saw how they really fall short on all three counts: logic, validity, and especially utility.
And bringing you back to our listener, this really provides that foundational context. Seeing how thinking about crime evolved from the supernatural to looking at, psychology, sociology, economics, it's a huge shift.
It really is. You get those aha moments understanding the history. So maybe a final thought to leave people with. Given how strongly people once believed in explanations that seem completely illogical to us now, what current ways of explaining complex social issues, maybe even crime, might future generations look back on and think, wow, how did they believe that?
That is a provocative question. It certainly makes you think about the limits of our current understanding and how knowledge keeps evolving.
Definitely food for thought. And as you said, this is really just scratching the surface. There are so many more criminological theories out there to explore.
Absolutely. This is just the beginning of a really fascinating field.